From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Kaylee Lyons. House Republicans reach a Plan C to try to avert a government shutdown, with a vote expected on the House floor this hour and just 7 hours to go until funding runs out. We'll get the latest from Capitol Hill with Republican Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis of New York and Democratic Congresswoman Gwen Moore of Wisconsin this hour. Plus, we'll have the details on one ask from Donald Trump that is not included in the new package, raising the debt ceiling. Our political panel will weigh in on that fight ahead. Thanks for joining us on this Friday evening. Within the hour, the House could vote on a revised stopgap measure to keep the government open. The bill, 118 pages long, extends funding until March 14th and includes disaster aid and an extension of the Farm Bill. Joining me now for more are Bloomberg's Megan Scully and Michael Shepard around the table here in our Washington, D.C. studio. So, Megan, is this effectively the same thing that failed in spectacular fashion on the House floor last night, just without the debt ceiling measure attached?
Pretty much, yes. We're trying to sort out if there are any other differences. I think it is about 2 pages longer, so we're currently going through the bill, but it is, for all intents and purposes, the same, minus the debt ceiling, which, of course, was such a huge hang-up for 38 Republicans last night and almost all of Democrats.
Well, and so that becomes the next logical question. The plan is to bring this to the floor under suspension of the rules, meaning it's going to need 2/3 of the House to vote for it to pass. Do we know where Democrats stand on this?
So Democrats are meeting right now at 5 o'clock. We're expecting them to call the vote any minute. So they don't have a whole lot of time to decide on this. Jeffries has not come out one way or the other on the bill. But we do know that he spoke with Johnson earlier today. The extent of that conversation hasn't really been revealed. I think that for Johnson, it was better to keep that under wraps so as not to infuriate Trump or Elon Musk about, any kind of bipartisan negotiating.
Well, we haven't heard from the president-elect yet on this, Mike. I keep refreshing Truth Social. We have, though, heard something from Elon Musk. He reposted on X a post from Thomas Massie, the Republican congressman, who talked about how Johnson changed his decision after speaking to Jeffries, as Megan was alluding to. And Elon Musk says, so is this a Republican bill or a Democrat bill, with a thinking emoji? Is that an indication he's not for this?
It's unclear, and it's really unclear where he will land with this final version of the bill. And remember, Elon Musk was the one who really upended what was supposed to be a spending bill. We probably wouldn't be talking about it this hour today if Musk had not intervened on Wednesday, tweeting his opposition to the bill with posts on X and continuing. And in a way, he was giving voice to what a lot of Republicans, especially conservatives, had felt about it. But he also ended up goading the president-elect into coming out in opposition and then also throwing in something he really wanted, which was an increase in the debt limit so that it would be off the plate of Congress next year and allow them to work more on his agenda.
Well, so when we consider that debt limit measure, Donald Trump was very clear. He wants this to happen before he takes the oath of office. That's January 20th. The new Congress sits on January 3rd. So even if it doesn't happen right now, we could theoretically still see a debt ceiling vote in the weeks in between the new year and the inauguration.
You could theoretically see one, but there are diehard members of the Republican caucus, as we saw last night, perhaps as many as 38 of them, who will vote against a debt ceiling increase, at least one without any kind of promises or set cost constraints. That's the holdup here, is that, people like Chip Roy, who the president-elect went after yesterday, they don't want to run up the government's credit card anymore. They want to see the expenditures coming down. So without that sort of tit for tat, they're going to be a no. And I don't see how you get there from January 3rd to January 20th.
Well, and this is something that Mark Warner, the Democratic senator from Virginia, talked about with me earlier on Balance of Power. With this whole debt ceiling idea, he's noted that it's spending you've already done, and you got to pay the credit card bill, basically. He also, when I asked him if he was willing to vote for what we understood at that time the House was putting forward, he basically said it's too early. Have we gotten any indication from the Senate, Mike, that even if the House can pull this off tonight, they will complete this legislative course of business and send it to President Biden?
That's a great question. We have been so focused on what the House, which is very narrowly led by Republicans, will do. And yet the Democrats still control the Senate. And we also have President Joe Biden still in the White House. And they also could stand somehow in the way of this. It's unlikely, based on what we see in the bill, that they would, but they haven't really been that much part of the conversation. And there are certain provisions that were eliminated from this spending package that they may have otherwise wanted to see in there. That includes funding for childhood cancer research. It includes a provision that would restrict outbound investment by U.S. firms in China. It also includes, for folks here at home in Washington who are sports fans, even a provision that would allow the District of Columbia to regain control of the RFK football stadium site. That would allow construction of a new stadium for Commanders fans. But it is big for sports business, and it's the kind of thing that usually, in the normal course of business, before somebody like Elon Musk intervenes, it does get added to these spending packages at the end of the year.
Well, on the normal course of business, obviously, if this can't get done by midnight, some normal business would presumably be disrupted. But Mike, just walk us through mechanically what realistically would happen if we go beyond this deadline, knowing we're heading into a weekend here, not a work day.
It would not be terribly disruptive. You know, the government, Megan and I have lived through a few of these before in our years covering Congress and Washington, where we enter what's called a technical shutdown. The agencies will proceed through the weekend, and government services, you won't really feel a thing. It does take several days for a lot of the more palpable effects to start showing up. And it may even take a few weeks, if, heaven forbid, this actually lasts that long, to see furloughs and things like that to actually have some bite. But the administration has been laying the groundwork for this and preparing agencies for it. And we even saw a flurry of announcements for example, from the Commerce Department, from the U.S. CHIPS Office. This is the entity that's administering the CHIPS Act funding. And they were getting some of these things out the door. They didn't say it was in relation to the shutdown, but you can sort of put two and two together that between the holidays and the threat of a shutdown, there were some things that they wanted to get taken care of ahead of time. So we do want to see just how long this lasts, if the Senate is aboard, if the House can get it done.
Yes, well, that's the first order of business. Again, we are expecting a floor vote could go within the hour, knowing that already twice Mike Johnson has swung at this and failed. Can he afford a third strike? And frankly, even if he gets it on the third try, is he still going to be able to be Speaker in January?
That is the big question once we get past this shutdown showdown, right? Tom Massey, a conservative, a fiscal conservative, has already said he will not vote for Johnson next year. So that's one. Depending on, confirmations and all of that, he really just has like a couple of votes to play with here. He needs a majority of all Republicans who are present and voting. Democrats he needs a majority of the chamber that is present and voting. Democrats will vote for Hakeem Jeffries. They will be united on that. I think we can guarantee that. Very little is guaranteed in Washington, but that is. As for Johnson, it's going to be interesting to see the fallout from this. I think a lot is going to depend on where Trump lands on this bill. And if he stays with Johnson, that's still some power in Johnson's pocket. If Elon stays with Johnson, same thing. If there's a fracture there at all, he's incredibly weakened, and we could see him go the way of Kevin McCarthy.
All right, Bloomberg's Megan Scully and Michael Shepard, thank you both so much for joining me. As of yet, nothing from the president-elect on True Social, so we're not sure of his feelings right now. But still ahead, we'll get the feeling on this new Plan C from Representative Nicole Malliotakis of New York. She'll be with us live from Capitol Hill, next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
I say this is somebody that was in business longer than been in politics. This was incompetence at a spectacular level. I'm looking forward to working with Donald Trump where I can, but he prides himself on art of the deal. There was days and days, and I believe my Senate Republican friends who are all ready for the deal, I think his team was told. But then to pull the rug out from under the feet of the Speaker, I mean, is this a preview of what's going to happen over the next 4 years?
A frustrated Democratic Senator Mark Warner of Virginia on the early edition of Balance of Power today. Thanks for joining us on this late edition on Bloomberg TV and radio. And joining me now live from Capitol Hill with more is Republican Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis of New York. Congresswoman, thank you very much for the time. A vote is expected at this hour, and I'm sure you too have felt a certain amount of frustration this week. Will you be a yes on this third attempt at a continuing resolution to fund the government?
I will vote for the continuing resolution today. I did vote for the continuing resolution last night. What I was against was the initial bill, the 1,500-page big ugly that had all sorts of unrelated policy that was agreed to by our speaker without any consultation from our conference. That was a problem, and I'm glad that we've gotten to, I think, a better place where it is a much skinnier bill, roughly less than 10% of what that initial bill was in size, and we are actually focused on what really matters: keeping the government open, helping our fellow Americans who have suffered from natural disasters recently, and supporting our farmers and so to protect our food supply chain. And that is it until President Trump is sworn in and settled, and I think that's the appropriate action.
Well, President Trump, the president-elect, had said before he's sworn in, he actually would like to see one more thing happen, and that was a lifting of the debt ceiling for a period of time, potentially to 2029, or eliminating it altogether. Obviously, Congresswoman, that is not included in this package, but it was included last night when the package went down. Was that a miscalculation on the debt ceiling? Can it be addressed before he takes office?
Well, I think it could have been. I think what President Trump was saying was that a lot of the spending that President Biden did has caught up to us, and he didn't want to have the debt ceiling hovering over him in his first initial 6 months when he's trying to do energy policy, when he's trying to do the border policies, when he's trying to get the tax bill across the finish line to preserve the tax cuts that our businesses and individuals and families have seen over the last few years that have created millions of jobs and lifted middle-class wages. I think that it would have been a lot, and it would have gave Democrats another tool to hold over President Trump's head. So I think he wanted to kind of come in there without that over him, which I can understand. Unfortunately, there were 35 within our party who voted, I mean, maybe even more than 35 that voted against it. And those are the so-called people who claim to be President Trump's allies. But what I will say is today it seems that Republicans are aligned, that we're united, and we're going to go in here and prevent a government shutdown and do the basics of what needs to be done to get us through the next few months until we have our trifecta sworn in and settled.
Well, you describe as the Republicans now having coalesced around what to do here. But Elon Musk, who, of course, was vocally opposed to the first iteration from Mike Johnson, has suggested it's unclear if this is a Republican bill or a Democrat one. Is his voice in all of this just adding an unhelpful layer of complication?
Well, as you know, President Trump endorsed the exact same bill yesterday, but it did have the debt limit, as you mentioned. But even without the debt limit, it's still a very good piece of legislation. It's the best that you're going to get at this moment, and it does what we need it to do. So I imagine that President Trump will support this final project. And I think that there's also been an understanding that we want to work with President Trump to address this debt limit issue, but we also want to see some savings, and that's where the Doge comes in. Elon Musk and the Doge, who wants to actually reduce wasteful spending, which there is a lot of, unfortunately, in federal government. And we all want to achieve that goal. I think we may have differences of where those cuts should come from, but I think that this sets it up nicely for us when we're all in office come January.
Well, I do have a question, Congresswoman, about the office that Mike Johnson will be holding. Obviously, he will remain a representative from Louisiana, but our question is whether he will remain as Speaker of the House. You have expressed frustration multiple times this week about the way leadership has conducted this entire negotiation. Does he, in your mind, deserve to keep the gavel?
Well, I think that's going to be a conversation for tomorrow. I will say that I've been tremendously frustrated by this process, the way that the Speaker made a deal with the Democrats without coming to the conference first to let us know that should have been done first, to come to the conference to get buy-in and get consensus before shaking hands with Jeffries and Chuck Schumer. So I am frustrated with the lack of communication that we're receiving from our leadership, and I'm also frustrated that there hasn't been enough emphasis in helping the rank and file members score small legislative wins, whether that be not things that don't cost money, that are not controversial, and would go a long way in us being able to deliver for our constituencies. So I think there needs to be a larger conversation, and I think many rank and file members may feel the way I do after this week. But I think one thing's for sure, this needs to be run a lot better next year. And I feel like a lot of us have these concerns that we want to express, and we hope that we're heard.
Well, so as we think about who would theoretically be able to run things better, it's a question of that, Congresswoman, but it's also a question if any other individual can get to 218 votes. We saw how this went when McCarthy was ousted. It took multiple people attempting to be Speaker for Mike Johnson to get it. Is that an avoidable scenario this time if it's not to be him?
And that is the issue. We have such a slim majority, so the question is always going to be who can get to 218. I think many of us would like to resolve our differences and have a better understanding of how we're going to proceed and help all rank and file members, not just a small select group of squeaky wheels in the next Congress. And hopefully we'll be able to have that discussion and get some clarity so we can move forward united as a team.
There's been some unclear if it's been jokes or not, Congresswoman, things percolating on social media. Even Elon Musk himself was asked about it with Donald Trump in Mar-a-Lago, whether someone like Elon Musk or Vivek Ramaswamy could end up being Speaker of the House. Would you want anyone who's not a member of the House of Representatives to serve in that position?
I don't see that happening. I think that's not very serious. I think that we can resolve these problems within our own conference and elect a speaker who is going to represent all the membership and listen to the concerns and views so we can move collected and united. I don't see looking outside of the House of Representatives as a viable solution.
And finally, Congresswoman, I know you need to leave us to run to the floor as this vote is about to happen. But given how hard this week has been, how optimistic are you about the first 100 days of the Trump administration, and how many bills realistically are going to be able to pass with ease?
Well, look, I think the big one is going to be the reconciliation package that we're hoping to address energy, unleashing our domestic production, repealing some of those unnecessary and burdensome regulations that have stymied energy production in this country, border security, which is so desperately needed, as we all know. And then the third piece of that would be the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, extending it and making improvements. Remember, a lot of these provisions have already expired. Some have sunset. The rest expires at the end of 2025. We're talking about the corporate tax rate, the income tax rate, the doubling of the standard deduction, the doubling of the child tax credit, and so many other important tax provisions that affect our economy and American working families. And so I think that needs to be coupled all together in the first reconciliation. I do get concerns that if we split up tax from the other items, that we may jeopardize those tax cuts expiring, which would really be problematic for our economy and working and middle class Americans. And so I make the push to say that this should be all done in the beginning, because what the tax people want and what the border states want and the energy producing states want, everybody will get something, and we can make a deal there. I think that if you split it up, it makes it a lot difficult, and that tax will be in the back end and may be forgotten of. And that's too much of a risk to take.
All right. Republican Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis of New York, thank you so much for your time joining us right ahead of an expected House vote on this continuing resolution. Thank you so much. Still ahead, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall will join on the debt limit and what may happen with it next, since it's not in this package. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. We are less than 7 hours away from a government funding deadline, and the House is getting ready to move forward with a spending plan that does not include President-elect Donald Trump's demand to address the debt limit. We are expecting this could go to the floor any minute in the House under what's called suspension of the rules, which would mean it requires a 2/3 majority in order to pass. And it's unclear whether or not Democrats will be providing those votes to get it across the finish line, though we do just have fresh reporting from our colleague Jack Fitzpatrick on Capitol Hill that the House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries is heralding the fact that the debt ceiling was removed from this new package. But we want to get more on that debt limit specifically. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall is joining me now live from Capitol Hill with more on the issue. Tyler.
Yeah, hey, Kelly. So the debt limit is always a politically fraught issue, and it's really what derailed negotiations here on Capitol Hill this week. Now, when President-elect Trump put forward that he wanted lawmakers to address the limit, he admitted that lifting it wasn't ideal, but that he'd rather that happen under the Biden administration instead of the incoming Trump administration. However, it turned out to be a bridge too far for too many Republicans, and Democrats say it was too hastily put through.
To pull the rug out from under the feet of the speaker? I mean, is this a preview of what's going to happen over the next 4 years? The debt ceiling is, we've already rung up those bills, and it's basically saying, are you going to pay your credit card bill on things you've already expended?
Congress last addressed the debt ceiling in June of 2023. 2 months later, Fitch downgraded the U.S. long-term credit rating to reflect what they called a growing government debt burden. The limit was suspended through January 1st of 2025 in a bid to make sure the fight over this wouldn't happen until after the election, since it's such a hot-button issue. The U.S. isn't expected to reach the X date, or the point where the government can't pay its bills anymore, until this summer. Now, Kaylee, you spoke with Republican Congressman Bill Huizenga earlier today. He's on House Financial Services, and he told you that he expects the debt ceiling to be one of the first priorities once Congress comes back in the new year.
What we understand is going to be discussed is looking at what happens after we come back in January 3 to continue that conversation. For me personally, what I would like to see then is what is the pressure point that replaces it? How else do we continue to have a sharp conversation about our debt and spending here in the country?
We'll have to see what the president-elect will support. In a post on Truth Social today, he suggested that Congress should either get rid of the debt ceiling completely or extend it to 2029. Now, part of why President-elect Trump wants this done now is that he campaigned on tax cuts. He's looking to make permanent many of his 2017 tax cuts, as well as implement new ones, such as no tax on tips, overtime pay, or Social Security. But Kaylee, ultimately, that's expected to add to the deficit, as well as reduce the federal revenue coming into the federal government by trillions of dollars that could go to paying down the debt. Kaylee.
All right. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, live from Capitol Hill. Thank you so much. Still ahead, our political panel will join me as we await what is expected to be a vote any minute on the House floor on this continuing resolution to keep the government funded beyond midnight tonight. We'll have more straight ahead on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We negotiated a good deal, not a perfect deal, a good deal. Democrats with Republicans. We had it signed, sealed, and almost delivered.
When we skimmed through it was the pork that was in it. You had things that had nothing to do with what we should be spending money on.
Now, here we are at the end of this Congress, still in chaos, dysfunction, and extremism.
I can't read minds and I can't tell fortunes, but I can tell you this. Every Republican in the House of Representatives, and I believe every Republican in the Senate, wants Donald Trump to succeed.
This, unfortunately, has become a holiday tradition, government brinksmanship, and so we're trying to break that.
What a difference just a few days make. Those were lawmakers from both sides of the aisle on Balance of Power this week, reacting to all of the twists and turns of a race to avoid a government shutdown. And they're still racing as we speak, with the House set to vote any minute now on a Plan C to continue funding until mid-March, with the deadline 6.5 hours away at midnight Eastern Time. Joining me now for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio is this evening's political panel, Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, alongside Lester Munson, co-head of the international practice at BGR Group and Republican strategist. Thank you both very much. Lester, this has been hard fought and it isn't technically over yet. Twice Speaker Johnson has failed. Can he hit it on the third try?
Well, you get 3 strikes until you're out. So maybe he's saving his best for last here. I think the pulling out of the debt limit extension is going to open up the possibilities here for a lot more Republicans to support the bill. And from what I'm hearing, Democrats are going to come out in favor of it as well. So it looks pretty good right now.
Jeannie, would you expect that to be true? Democrats will come out in force in a way they decidedly did not when Plan B failed on the House floor yesterday?
Yes, I do. I think if the debt ceiling is out, and provided there are nothing stuck in there that they don't approve of, and of course it depends on what Hakeem Jeffries says. We hear a lot of Democrats, they obviously want to go home like Republicans, but they are really looking to their leader on this one. But I do think it can get through. But I think one of the things that we don't talk a lot about is how many representatives are still in the House. You know, some people have already left. So the number is going to be a little bit touch and go once they start to vote to see how many people are there and what they need to get that 2/3.
Well, that's an excellent point. And of course, once we get an idea of the tally ultimately in the House, once this vote takes place, we'll bring you the figures. But Lester, to this notion that the reason why you may have more support for this is simply because you took out the debt ceiling. That was the one part that President-elect Donald Trump wanted in the bill. He explicitly said, no deal if you don't at least lift it until 2029 or abolish it entirely. So why would they go against him?
There's a lot of things to unpack here. I think over the holidays, hopefully when we're looking back at this very interesting experience we're all having, President Trump seems to have been in a different position than Prime Minister Elon Musk on a lot of these issues. Where is actual President Joe Biden on all of these things? He just sends out his spokesperson to complain. And where are the Democrats who were rock solid for debt limit extensions previously when Joe Biden was an active president, and now are voting against debt limit extensions when it seems like President-elect Trump is the acting president?
Well, Jeannie, Lester raises a great point. Where is Joe Biden? Because Donald Trump for days has been saying if there is a shutdown, it will fall on the current president. Is the current president going to be able to take a victory lap if there's not a shutdown? But it doesn't really seem like he had anything to do with that.
Yeah, no, I know Donald Trump would like to say this is all on Joe Biden. I'm extremely critical, probably overly critical of the Biden administration and Joe Biden. And I share the frustration of people asking where he is. But on this, the reality is this is all the Republicans. No matter how they want to point, where they want to point, this is on them. They control the House. They had a bipartisan agreement. They had it geared up to go until Elon Musk pulled the rug out from under and Donald Trump followed suit. It wasn't Joe Biden who did that. So, you know, I just saw in the Bulwark somebody saying we have 3 presidents, which means we have 0. And I think there's some reality to that. But the blame for this, if they can't pull this third vote out, is going to fall on the Republicans who can't get it together. And this is just a very bad sign for them as to what's to come in the 119th, because they are going to have an even narrower margin when we get into next year.
If you're with us on Bloomberg TV, you do see a live image of the House floor where voting has started on this continuing resolution. It will be ongoing for the next 14 minutes or so as we watch here the tally. So far, more yay votes than nay votes, but a lot of members have yet to vote. A moment ago, Lester, you suggested that 3 strikes and you're out for Speaker Mike Johnson. But I do wonder if he gets 3 strikes, or if 2 this week was enough, as there already have been members who have expressed dissatisfaction with the way he conducted this whole business and have suggested he may not have their support to be Speaker again when the 119th Congress sits. Sure,
and I think some of that grumbling is understandable given the real misread that he may have had on that first vote of the kind of the heavy Christmas tree package.
The 1,500 pager.
Yeah, that was a lot to digest, and members didn't get a chance to really dig into it. So I think it's fair to criticize him over that. At the same time, he then immediately went to the Donald Trump approved plan, and that went and that had less support than what he had done. At the end of the day, if they're able to do this today or early tomorrow morning and get this done, I think members will settle down over the break and come back, and Johnson will probably be okay. Because for one thing, there's not a lot of people who want to be speaker. This is the hardest job in America right now, is being the speaker of a Republican-controlled House of Representatives with, as Jeannie points out, a vote margin of 2, which is, if my math is correct, less than 0.5%. It's extraordinarily close.
Yeah, it is. And ultimately, Jeannie, if this is successful, it will be because Johnson spoke with Leader Jeffries, it seems, and agreed that they would put this on the floor under suspension. At least that's what has been suggested in the reporting, though we haven't heard that much from Hakeem Jeffries himself. Is Mike Johnson still the best broker that Democrats could hope to work with next year?
Yeah, I mean, I think he is. And I will tell you, my prediction is that we do keep Speaker Johnson, the Republicans do. And I'll tell you why. Because if there is no speaker, they can't count the electoral votes and Donald Trump can't become president. And I don't think we're going to want that. And by law, you'd have to see Joe Biden and Kamala Harris step aside and Chuck Grassley would become the president. So that's not something I see either Donald Trump or Elon Musk abiding by. So I think they're going to have to wake up to the reality that it's Johnson, because to Lester's point, there's not a lot of other people in the waiting. The problem is not Mike Johnson. The problem was never Kevin McCarthy. I'm not big fans of these folks. This is a problem of the role. It is an impossible job that these folks have. It doesn't matter who you put in there, even Elon Musk. It's not going to work because the role is nearly impossible at this point.
Well, and as you suggested, Prime Minister Elon Musk earlier, Lester, it does raise the question on to what extent Mike Johnson is going to have to get the approval, not just of Donald Trump, but for Elon Musk, or from Elon Musk, for any decisions he makes if he indeed gets to keep the gavel next year.
I think in a weird way, the Prime Minister Musk intervention here was a substitute for the Freedom Caucus. The biggest problem at the end of the day for Speaker Johnson is the Freedom Caucus. They're not going to vote for the stuff that Donald Trump tells them to vote for. In the grand scheme of things, Donald Trump's biggest problem politically in the House in particular is the Freedom Caucus. That's why Mike Johnson has that problem. That's why Elon Musk can kind of tweet some stuff out and look like he's the leader of things, because he knows he's in the same place as the Freedom Caucus.
All right, Lester Munson and Jeannie Shanzana will be sticking with me. But for now, I want to go back to Capitol Hill, where joining me live is Republican Congresswoman Beth Van Duyne of Texas. Congresswoman, thank you very much for your time this evening. I'm sure in a few minutes here you have to get to the floor. When you get there, will you be voting yes to this continuing resolution?
I will not. I will be voting no. I am not in the House Freedom Caucus, but I am a fiscal conservative, and I haven't voted for a continuing resolution yet. I voted against, the increase in spending. I think we really got a mandate from the American people in November. Stop the crazy overspending of federal funds. We've seen inflation as high as 20%. We have a debt that's over $36 trillion. It's insane. We got a mandate, stop that spending. And all a continuing resolution does is continue that level of spend, the pre-pandemic, or the pandemic level spending, the Nancy Pelosi era spending. And I think we have made a commitment, every one of us in our campaigns that won, we said we're going to get that under control. And I think it sends a really bad message to have one of the last bills of the year right after the election be that we're going to continue that same level.
Well, as a fiscal conservative, Congresswoman, what went through your head when Donald Trump suggested the debt limit, which is supposed to be in place to encourage fiscal restraint, be abolished entirely?
Look, well, he wasn't asking for it to be abolished entirely. He was asking for a 2-year extension.
He did suggest that.
Well, I'm fine as long as we can have a match off. If we're going to increase it, the deal that I understood, we met with J.D. Vance this morning and with the speaker this morning. We had over a 3-hour-long meeting about what the president was requesting. And he was looking at a $1.5 trillion debt ceiling increase, but they were going to offset it with $2.5 trillion of cuts. Now, if we're talking about that kind of math, I'm all in it. Let's have that discussion. And again, you have to show how you're going to offset the debt, because that, I think, is one of our biggest, national security issues. And the albatross that we're leaving on our kids next, our grandkids next, is going to be unattainable. When almost half of every dollar that the government collects is being spent on debt, we've got a problem. When more of that is being spent than on defense complete.
Well, so on that $2.5 trillion of cuts, wouldn't that just mathematically have to touch Social Security and Medicare? Does that have to be on the table if this is to be reality?
I'm optimistic about what DOGE is going to be able to bring. I've been saying this for years that we need to attack and go after the ridiculous over-regulation that we tied our American businesses. When we have actually given them tax cuts, we've actually seen more revenues pour in to the American coffers because the businesses are being more successful. They're moving from overseas back to the U.S. They are investing in their employees. They're investing in their businesses. I think there's a lot to be gained on that. And I've often said, on the regulatory front, if you're talking to doctors who are complaining about health care, if you are able to actually spend more time with your physician, with your patients, and less time with your head in a computer because you're playing CYA with the insurance companies because of the regulatory efforts of CMS, would that help? And they always say yes. So let's go ahead and give DOGE a chance. Let's see what it would mean. I have been talking about it. I've said it's not going to make headlines. It's not sexy, but I was proven wrong. You put Elon Musk, you put Vivek Ramaswamy in front of it, and look, they have been able to do some incredible things on the private sector side. Let's see what they're able to do with the public sector.
Well, as if on cue, Congresswoman, we just got a new post on X from Elon Musk who says the speaker did a good job here given the circumstances. It went from a bill that weighed pounds to a bill that weighed ounces. I would love your thoughts on just how Speaker Johnson handled this and whether or not you believe he deserves to stay Speaker in the 119th.
I do not envy him his job. He's got a one-member and one-vote majority in the House, and I will tell you, I don't think the man sleeps. He has been working tirelessly. We met this morning at 7:40 in the morning. He met with over 20 of our Congress members to try to get our insights. Why some of us voted for the bill last night, some of us voted against the bill last night. But he has been very, I think, his outreach to talk to members has been very encouraging. And in the same token, he needs every single vote on an agenda moving forward. And I think he has done a decent job given the tremendous hurdles that he's had to face.
Well, and certainly there is no indication that the hurdles are going to get materially lower in the next Congress when the majority he'll be working with, at least at the onset, Congresswoman, is going to be even narrower. So when we consider the prospects of reconciliation, of trying to get some of the legislative agenda items through in the early days of the Trump administration, are you confident that if it has to be two different reconciliation packages, both will ultimately get through?
I have been very clear that I think it needs to be one reconciliation package. I think, if we're looking at taxes and getting a tax bill in there, which is going to be necessary, if we don't get the TCJA provisions extended, you're going to see 90% of American taxpayers have a tremendous increase in their taxes. And I don't think that's what we want. In the same token, I think you're also going to see a more willingness from House Republicans, even though we have a very narrow majority, to get these bills passed. Because this session, when we're dealing with a Democrat in the White House, we're dealing with a Democrat-run Senate, a lot of these bills that we pass are messaging bills. But if we actually stand a chance to have the Senate, we're not looking at what the lowest common denominator in the Senate is willing to pass. We're actually looking at a Republican-led Senate. Some of the bills that we're going to be able to get out are going to be extremely strong. And then we're actually going to have a president who's willing to sign them. So I think the partnership that you're going to see between the House and Senate is going to be a lot different than what you've seen this last Congress and the one before it.
Just for our Bloomberg Television and radio audiences, an update on where the vote count stands right now. There's still 4.5 minutes left to go. So far, 141 members have voted in favor, 41 Democrats included in that. There's only 17 nays, all of them to this point on the Republican side. Congresswoman, I know you will not be a yes to this package. You want to see more fiscal restraint. So what do you think is actually appropriate when it comes to the tax policies that will be included in that reconciliation package? No tax on overtime, Social Security tips. Should all of those things be in there?
I think we need to look at all of those things. And as I mentioned before, when you start looking at some of the programs from the TCJA and what they were able to achieve as far as economic growth, repatriating of businesses back to America, the investment that they've had in employees and in businesses in the future of their businesses and the growth of the economy, those are all things that we need to consider. So if those provisions were allowed to expire, which they would if we're not able to get a tax bill passed, it would be horrendous. It would be horrible for working Americans. It would be horrible for our economy and for American businesses. So I am very optimistic that having a partnership with a Senate that is a majority Republican, a House a Republican majority as well, with a president who is all fighting for this, that we're going to be able to get on the same page. I'm very optimistic.
All right, Congresswoman, thank you very much for joining us. 3 minutes left in this vote, so we'll let you go. Republican Congresswoman Beth Van Duyne of Texas, really appreciate your time. And still with me around the table here is my political panel this evening, Lester Munson and Jeannie Shanzana, who I guess isn't technically around the table. She's joining us from New York. But Jeannie, so far, and I'm sure you can see this from New York, it does seem that this thing is on track to pass. At least right now, there are way more yeas than there are nays, with 50 Democratic votes in the yes column right now. Are you surprised by those numbers?
No, I'm not. What we're hearing is that Hakeem Jeffries is supportive with some caveats, and still trying to look and see what those caveats are of this bill. And so I do think, when you look at those numbers, all the Democrats who have voted so far, with a few minutes to go, have been supportive. And I think that's reflective of the Democratic leadership. But, again, to your conversation, which was so fascinating with the representative, is the fact that you do have a number of Republicans who are still not satisfied. And you had Jake Sherman from Punchbowl News reporting that there was a heated exchange on the floor between Andy Harris and the speaker just a few minutes ago. And of course, he is from the contingent of about 30 to 40 Republicans who are usually no votes on the CRs and the lifting the debt. So it is fascinating to see this has changed nothing with that portion of the Republican Party, and it's going to take Dems to get this over the hurdle.
Well, so why should we believe anything will be different next year, Lester, when we're talking about, as I was just discussing with the Congresswoman, a reconciliation package that's going to cut taxes in a lot of ways Democrats wouldn't like to see, probably be inclusive of some border measures not all Democrats will be supportive of, and yet can it get done without them?
This is the great question. What's the timing of it? They're going to have to wait until April, probably until these 3 empty House Republican seats of people who are going in to serve in the Trump administration in all likelihood, or who have already left. They got to fill those, so they have about a 5-vote margin. I think that's something where you'll see more unanimity among Republicans when it comes to tax cuts and some of these other issues. So it's got a stronger chance of getting through than this spending package, which is kind of the basic operations of government. So I think that might be a little bit of an easier lift. And the Congresswoman makes an interesting point about, hey, let's try to bank on just one. These things are very difficult to do. The parliamentary process is not easy. One shot is probably better than trying to do it twice.
Well, so as we reckon with reality, frankly, here, that yes, as Lester describes, Jeannie, these things clearly are not easy. This week was not easy, I don't think, for anyone. It certainly wasn't for me, if I can speak selfishly for a second, and I'm sure the same goes for everyone on Capitol Hill. So when we consider the notion that Donald Trump put in a lot of asks this week, Elon Musk obviously had things he wanted to see done as well. Do you think this week maybe provided an expectation reset as to how smoothly all of their laundry list of things they want to accomplish actually can get done, that the mandate they were given to govern may not actually be bulletproof and suggesting you have a blank slate to do everything you want?
Let's hope. It was an important reminder. And I think, the fact that Elon Musk, that tweet that you mentioned, I think it's indicative of the fact that maybe he is seeing that this is the best that can be done. Because while the Republicans won and they will control Washington next year, the fact is the Republicans in the House do not have the support of their own caucus to move most of these bills. That's why Mike Johnson was reaching across the aisle. A big, big lesson from this week, and a problem for Mike Johnson, is the fact that Hakeem Jeffries has been very clear. Trust was broken this week. How can you negotiate in good faith with somebody and then break that negotiation the way they did and expect them to come back to the table? So I think that's going to be a relationship they're going to have to repair going forward, because, again, they're going to need Democrats to do almost everything they want to do going forward in the new year.
Well, one Democrat, or at least his White House, has chimed in. We just got a statement from the White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre on this legislation, in which she says the president does support this proposal. She says, while it does not include everything we sought, it includes disaster relief that the president requested for the communities recovering from storms, eliminates an accelerated pathway to a tax cut for billionaires, and would ensure that the government can continue to operate at full capacity. So for all of our complaining, Lester, perhaps about how this all has unfolded, at the end of the day, this will be accomplishing some pretty important things that we shouldn't lose sight of.
We got 6 hours to go before the government shuts down. Everything is fine. It's still kind of the working hours for most of us here on a Friday. I think it's fine. No, I think this is a little too nerve-wracking, and we make good points about the real struggles the Republicans are going to have next year to pass anything. Speaker Johnson, who is only still in office, because earlier this year he relied on Democratic votes to avoid a mutiny in his party, is going to be relying on those votes again next year. I think he's kind of paved that path already, and he's going to be probably okay with it. For one thing, there's really no one else who's running for the job, so he's kind of the guy. I'm not sure who the other candidate would ever be, and that's probably the biggest thing he has going for him.
All right, I want to add the voice here of Megan Scully, who leads our Capitol Influence team from here in Washington. As we have seen the vote timer go down to zero, though not all the votes have been cast. There's still 151 members who have not voted. But right now the tally is 254 yay, only 26 nay. All of those, Megan Scully, Republicans. So far, there has not been a single Democratic vote against this measure.
Yes, I think we are getting very close to saying it is going to pass the House. The Democrats have been holding back a little bit, and they had been in a caucus meeting right before this vote, and now they're coming to the floor, and we will likely have a House passed funding bill here in a few minutes. Democrats are already talking to reporters about how they're planning to leave immediately after to get home for the holidays.
Oh, those jet fumes are in the air. But of course, it's not just as easy as this passing the House. It will still have to get through the Senate. As I mentioned, President Biden has just signaled his support, so we should expect his signature. But just mechanically, with 6 hours to go, is this all going to be able to happen in time?
So you can do anything in the Senate with unanimous consent. That is the key part, unanimous consent. And you have obstructionists, as they are called within their own caucus even, like Mike Lee and Rand Paul, who abhor government spending. And we can expect them to perhaps threaten to tie things up now and force, all kinds of procedural motions. Now, they could be sweetened or encouraged by saying, we'll give you a vote on this amendment that is sure to fail. It's definitely going to fail. We'll debate it, then we'll go to final passage. That has happened before, and I don't want to be too, predict too much here, but I suspect, given that we are just butting up against the holidays, it's Friday night, that we may very well see that happen maybe before midnight.
Well, and of course, we should keep in mind here that even if we do go slightly after midnight, technically it will be a shutdown, quote unquote, because there will be a funding lapse, but it won't necessarily disrupt any government operations or people's paychecks ahead of the holidays.
Yeah, little known fact in Washington, it's not actually a shutdown until the White House says it's a shutdown. So if they vote at 3 a.m., they probably will not deem any kind of shutdown. So we'll see. I'll be up watching for sure.
Oh, we know you will. I would just point out that as of now, the House does have enough votes to pass this stopgap funding measure, that the vote is ongoing. Right now, the tally 303 yay to just 30 nay. So it does look like this will pass by a wide and bipartisan margin. I'm sure, Megan, it is a big sigh of relief for House Speaker Mike Johnson, but I do wonder how long that good feeling might ultimately last, as he is looking down the road just a matter of weeks when he has to stand for election as Speaker again.
2 weeks to the day.
Not a lot of time.
Which seems very, very soon to me. Hopefully we can all get a little time off in between. But yes, he's already sort of disrupted the ultra-conservatives in his caucus. As I said earlier, Tom Massey from Kentucky has said that he will vote against Johnson. He can spare very few votes. This majority in the next Congress, because this will happen after the new Congress is sworn in, is even smaller than the current Congress. And then you have a few that are leaving to join the Trump administration as well.
Well, we are expecting to hear from Speaker Johnson in just a few minutes. He does have remarks scheduled for 6 p.m. Eastern time. So, Megan Scully, stick with me as we await those. I want to bring back in Jeannie Shanzano and Lester Munson. Lester, obviously, the Speaker is the one that helped get this done. His third try does seem to have been the charm. What would you expect him to say when he speaks to the press? Is he feeling good right now, or just kind of beat down?
I think he kind of came into this process a year ago, beat down already. It's been a rough road. This is not unusual. So I think he's probably going to feel pretty good about it. He's probably going to complain about Democrats not being willing to vote for the debt limit extensions in the earlier package. And he has actually a pretty decent point there, because Democrats made that a big deal when President Biden was our active president, how important it was to extend the debt limit, that it should never be in question. And then, gosh darn it, they voted against it now that Donald Trump is the acting president of the United States.
Well, and Jeannie, we did speak about that earlier today, this notion that Democrats have been supportive of raising the debt ceiling. You contend that it's different because Donald Trump wants to do it around tax policy. All that said, though, do you expect that Democrats could work in a bipartisan way come January with this administration and the new Republican majorities in both chambers in that regard?
Yeah, I think they can. I think we have to remember the context here. They had negotiated an agreement with Mike Johnson, nothing to do with the debt ceiling. They do still support the debt ceiling, which it is absolutely ridiculous that we have when it should be lifted. But the reality is that only came so that Donald Trump could more easily put through the extension of the tax cuts for billionaires and corporate taxes, and with no spending cuts attached to those and no interest in helping or supporting any of the programs that the Democrats want to support. And so it would be, inconceivable that Democrats would have last night supported the debt ceiling raise. To get the debt ceiling raised, they are going to have asks, and that is how negotiation works. So I don't find this surprising. I think the reality here is what it's always been. The Republican Party has enormous ideological diversity in it, and they do not agree on what it means to be fiscally responsible. Donald Trump was not in his campaign advocating for fiscal responsibility. With $7.7 trillion he will probably add to the debt. And people like Chip Roy are talking about that. And so they're going to have to work that out. You can't point the finger at the Democrats for what is a problem for this Republican caucus and has been for a long time.
Well, and remarkably, right now, when you look at the yay votes, there are more Democrats who voted for this measure than Republicans. 170 members of the Republican Party have voted for this package. 32 voted nay. There has been 0 Democratic votes in opposition. In fact, 181 of them, 11 more than Republicans, have voted here. But Jeannie, considering this all began with bipartisan negotiations and what the product of that was a 1,500-page monstrosity, including things like outbound investment limits on China, a pay raise for lawmakers, any number of other measures, throw in RFK Stadium in there. Why didn't Democrats just start here with Mike Johnson if they clearly were willing to vote for it?
Yeah, because Mike Johnson came to them to negotiate this out. The reality is Mike Johnson had a choice. He could have done this to begin with. He chose not to, and he paid the price for that. And so Democrats, they are there. They are in the minority. When he comes to them because he needs their votes, they are absolutely going to have asks for what gets attached to that bill. But, let's think about the outbound, for instance. That wasn't necessarily a Democratic ask, right? So there's a lot of things in there that the Republicans wanted in there and Mike Johnson wanted in there that got put in there. And of course, the sausage, it's an ugly process. We know that every year. And this should be done by regular order. The, Chip Roys of the world are right about that, but it hasn't been for years.
Lester, we haven't heard anything yet from the president-elect Donald Trump after he was so vocal earlier in this process. What do you make of that?
Well, it's possible he was learning from his mistakes. His direct involvement didn't seem to be helping the situation earlier. Clearly, the speaker has a good relationship with him, and that is the basis of his position as the speaker. And so I suspect the speaker leaned on him heavily to say, hey, you need to give us some bandwidth here to get this thing done, which you want done and is good for you coming in as the president. So I suspect this was just kind of some smart politics on the president-elect's part.
Well, we haven't heard from the president-elect yet. We also haven't necessarily heard from Chuck Schumer specifically. So to bring Megan Scully back into this conversation, when would we expect to hear from the Democratic Majority Leader to say, OK, now here's the plan with 6 hours to go?
Yes, I think we should be expecting to see him go to the floor here probably within the hour. This afternoon they spent saying goodbye to Mitch McConnell, who's not leaving the Senate, but is stepping down as the longtime GOP leader and doing some other end of year ceremonies and whatnot. So now the attention turns to the Senate and specifically Rand Paul and Mike Lee to see how difficult they're going to make to get this done before midnight, and if they can be convinced to stand down or at least to go along with it with, like I said, promises of amendment votes.
Well, as we think about the parting words of Mitch McConnell on the Senate floor, obviously not parting from the Senate, but stepping down as leader, the last speech he will give as leader, he warned about this whole shutdown game and the notion that everybody knows that you can't actually just blame the other party for a shutdown, essentially. And I wonder to what extent you think those words actually tonight, Megan, were largely heated as lawmakers got together and decided we can't do this politically.
I'm not so sure about that. I think that there are a small handful of people for whom Mitch McConnell's word still carries a lot of weight in the Senate. I think his stance on January 6th and other comments he's made over the years about the president-elect have made many, particularly in the House, where they tend to be a little bit more pro-Trump, and there's a much stronger MAGA wing. I'm not sure that they heeded his advice there. But he's right. I mean, we seem to come up to this deadline every single time, and it's this scurry at the end, and it is disruptive. It's disruptive for government employees. It's disruptive for government functions, it's just if it goes on long enough, it can be disruptive for the country, in which case that's not good for either party.
Well, that's absolutely true, especially in a time of political transition such as this one. I do wonder what this means as well for once this transition has happened and Donald Trump is in office and he wants to accomplish all these things legislatively. He'd been listening to John Thune in the Senate say, let's do 2 packages, get some early wins on the border and energy policy. We'll deal with tax later. Could this potentially this week, how hard this was, lead to a change of tune on the part of the incoming Senate Majority Leader?
I think quite possibly, yes. I think there will be a lot of discussions between now and January 20th about Donald Trump's 100-day agenda and what part of this reconciliation package, this Republican-only package that he wants to pass through both chambers, what part of it is feasible to be done in that first 100 days? Some of it will depend on, whether Musk continues to exert this kind of power. He has certainly emerged as the agitator in chief, and he was the first one to come out across the spending bill. So it will be something certainly to watch. Thune and Trump don't have the closest of relationships. Sure. Of course, they were at the Army-Navy game together just last weekend. I can't believe that was less than a week ago. But this is a relationship that's going to need some forging here over the next weeks and months.
All right, well, we have just gotten the gavel. The House has officially passed this stopgap funding measure that will keep the government funded through March 14th of next year. The tally, 366 votes for this measure, only 34 against. Not a single one of those votes against came from a Democrat. Ultimately, it was the Democrats who provided more votes to get this over the finish line. 196 Democratic members voting yes compared to 170 Republicans. I want to come back to our political panel, Jeannie Shanzano and Lester Munson here. Lester, there were 38 Republicans who last night voted down the measure, inclusive of the debt ceiling. 34 Republicans voted down this today with the debt ceiling taken out. It only changed 4 minds on that front. What does that signal to you?
Well, it also changed the minds of all the Democrats.
Well, fair enough, yes.
Right? And that's really the key here. And so Democrats are clearly, I take Jeannie's earlier points on this exact question to heart. Democrats want to kind of force the votes next year and maximize their leverage over these tax issues, which they are clearly going to be targeting. So you're starting to see the Democrats marshal their forces behind an agenda, thinking coherently about what that means, being willing to take some tough votes to get that done. And you saw there was one present vote among the Democrats. So there's one Democrat who didn't vote in favor of this thing. So they have near total unanimity. They've got some real leadership. The question is going to be, I think, next year, can Senator Thune and Speaker Johnson do the same thing that McConnell and Ryan did 8 years ago when they really guided the president's domestic agenda through Congress? Can these new leadership members do something like that next year? It's going to be a real challenge for them.
Well, so Jeannie, this is an excellent point that Lester is making, this notion that by and large, we do see the Democrats sticking together, and ultimately whatever Hakeem Jeffries says is usually what goes. And I wonder if you think that is going to be as easy to maintain when they are being asked to take votes on things like securing the border, something that was a weak spot for Democrats, frontline Democrats especially, in the last election and likely will be again in 2026.
Yeah, I think we've seen Hakeem Jeffries emerge as a very strong leader following, the suit of Nancy Pelosi, who's also, one of the best that we've had. And the reality is that he does have the respect of his caucus. And we've seen over and over again in almost lockstep, to Lester's point, that they do listen to his advice. And that bodes very well for him. It's not going to be easy, but I will say it is easier, obviously, obviously, to be in the minority than it is to be in the majority. So, it may be a different story if they took over the majority, but because they're in the minority, I think they will stick together next year. And the reality is that it is going to be so close next year that Mike Johnson is going to need them again. And that's not going to sit well with people like Andy Biggs and Chip Roy and many others on the Republican side. And the question is, how does Donald Trump handle this? Particularly, how does he handle it when somebody like Elon Musk is controlling the largest megaphone maybe we have out there in terms of the Republican media? And when he shouts, everybody listens. That's going to be really fascinating to watch.
Well, Elon Musk's counterpart in leading this new Department of Government Efficiency has just posted his thoughts on X. Vivek Ramaswamy saying, quote, "The last 72 hours highlighted the positive impact that Doge can have, but it also laid bare the massive lift ahead next year. We're ready for it." Lester, both Vivek and Elon Musk aren't exactly ultra familiar with Washington. Do you really think they are ready for it?
No, but I do like the way everyone is kind of dumping their hopes and dreams into the Doge, right? Oh, this problem will be fixed next year with Doge. Oh, Doge has a huge opportunity. Doge has already affected things. Doge isn't really even a thing yet. It does certainly have some potential. Their real work won't be done for a year and a half. Will this still matter then? Will President Trump still have the same relationship with those two? That's a big question. So I think it's mostly hopes and dreams right now, but it certainly could become reality if people actually sit down and look at it. Interestingly, there was a Tom Cole article in the Wall Street Journal this morning talking about they're going to have to look at entitlements if they really want to get close to a balanced budget. There's real truth in that. And that's not really something Republicans want to tackle yet.
Well, when I was speaking with Congresswoman Beth Van Duyne just a moment ago, she was talking about how they said, yes, we're going to raise the debt ceiling, but we're going to cut $2.5 trillion in spending in order to offset that. And Megan Scully, mathematically, that probably doesn't work if you're going to not be touching Social Security and Medicare.
It absolutely does not. $2.5 trillion is more than the federal discretionary budget on an annual basis. So to put it in perspective, the Defense Department is creeping up to $1 trillion when you factor in emergency spending, and everything else is dwarfed in comparison. So finding that means digging deep into entitlements, and that's when I think you're going to see particularly House members and senators who are up for election in 26 really getting nervous, because that Social Security is the third rail. And there are a lot of weird rules about how we can legislate on Social Security and whether or not it can be part of this budget deal, whether it has to be dealt with separately. But it is... but when you're talking about entitlements, you're not just talking about Social Security. You're talking about Medicare. You're talking about Medicaid. And you're talking about veterans benefits, which is something that lawmakers are very loath to rescind.
Well, but that doesn't mean that Ramaswamy and Musk might not recommend it. But at the end of the day, and Lester was alluding to this, they are not elected members of the U.S. government. They can only do recommendations technically. Have we not learned this week, though, that their words ultimately can matter to legislation even before they've made their Doge recommendations?
Yes and no, right? So Musk has touted, look at the, 1,500-page bill, versus this 140 or however many page bill it is, and looking at the differences between the size. The fact of the matter is the majority of that spending is still in there. And if that is what Doge is going after, that $110 billion for farmers and for disaster aid, tells you something, that lawmakers were not going to cut that, because that affects people's lives in their districts and in their states.
Absolutely. And Jeannie, we just have about a minute or two left here, but considering this is our last evening edition of Balance of Power of the year 2024, and we are ending it like this with a down-to-the-wire vote, basically trying to avert a government shutdown that the Senate has to still act on. Given everything that has gone down in this year, does this surprise you in the slightest that we ended up in this moment at the very end of it?
Not at all, although I am thrilled that they did pass the government. It keeps it open. People can go home for the holidays, including you, Kayleigh, who deserves a holiday and a rest. But, this is the 118th. That's how it's been from the very, very start. And it has continued this way. I would say I want to be optimistic and say the 119th is going to be different. But mathematically, and this is a game of numbers, can't imagine how it could be that much different.
All right, final question to all three of you. Jeannie, Will the Senate be able to pass this measure by midnight?
Yes, they will. Megan just explained it. Thank you, Megan.
And Megan, your answer is still yes, I'm assuming.
I hope so.
We all hope so. Lester Munson, final word to you.
Also yes, but there's going to be some votes on Lee and or Rand Paul amendments.
Megan predicted that one as well. Thank you so much to all three of you for joining me as we have worked through this breaking news in Congress as we work to avert a government shutdown. Megan Scully, who leads our Capitol Influence team here in Washington, Jeannie Shanzano, and Lester Munson, my political panel this evening. Thank you so much. Again, the stopgap funding measure to keep the government funded through March 14th of next year has passed the House by a wide bipartisan margin, more Democrats putting up votes for it than Republicans. It will now go to the Senate. And one Republican senator has weighed in, Senator Lindsey Graham, posting on X that he expects this stopgap will sail through the Senate. We'll all have to stay tuned and find out. Remember, the deadline is midnight. If we cross it, it's a technical shutdown, but it might not be that bad. Whew. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power, and thank you for your viewership and listenership throughout this entire year. 2024 has been a wild ride, and we appreciate you spending some of it with us right here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Happy holidays to you all.